Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rao's IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. The what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. So as you have known so far that on every Sunday, we were discussing important articles of the Hindu newspaper from last Sunday along with explained section of Indian Express from the last week which were not covered in daily DNS lectures. But now, based on the feedback from our viewers, from now on every Sunday, we will be taking up the Hindu newspaper of the same day along with the explained section of Indian Express from the last week which are not covered in the daily DNS lectures. The DNS edition of Sunday would contain the Hindu newspaper of the same Sunday and explained section of Indian Express of the last week. But at the same time, we have also ensured that our students do not miss out on any important news from the Hindu newspaper dated 2nd of January 2022. So today, we are covering important news articles from last Sunday, 2nd January, this Sunday, 9th January, and important news from explained section of Indian Express of the last week. Let us now begin the discussion. So the first article for today's discussion, Respect Laws Passed by Tamil Nadu Assembly, CM Tells Governor, appears on page number 1, and rightly so. Because Tamil Nadu Chief Minister has said yesterday that it was the basic principle of a democracy that when the Assembly of a state invoked its rights to enact a law, the governor should respect it and give his approval. And the context over here is that the Tamil Nadu state legislature and the government is opposed to the idea of national eligibility cum entrance test on a national level. Tamil Nadu government and the legislature feel that if it is enacted in Tamil Nadu, it is going to work against the interests of the local students. And so, they have tried to come up with a legislation which they fear might be reserved by the governor for the consideration of the president. And so this again brings us a very important issue of center-state relation to the front. If you look into GS Paper 2 syllabus, functions and responsibilities of the union and the states, issues and challenges pertaining to federal structure is a part of your syllabus. And if you try to delineate the federal structure and the issues into multiple dimensions, you will have legislative issues, you will have financial issues, you will have executive issues. And there, in the legislative matters, reservation of the bill by the governor for the consideration of the president is one of the most perplexing issues which the states have complained since the independence. Because more often than not, this becomes a key tool in the hands of the central government to control the state legislations. And so in this regard, we are going to first understand the constitutional mechanisms being provided under Article 200 and 201. What are the loopholes in this mechanism which enable the control of the center over the state legislations? What are the arguments which can be presented for and against the continuance of such a mechanism, and what has been the way forward which has been suggested by the Punchi Sarkaria and Administrative Reforms Commission? Let us now begin the discussion. Alright, so let us now begin the discussion right from the very basics. All of us know that Constitution of India makes the governor a component part of the state legislature through Article 168, which means that the bill is incomplete without the assent of governor, just like a bill of a parliament is incomplete, will not become an act without assent or approval of president. And in order to become an act, every bill has to be passed by state legislature and must receive his or her assent. The Legislative Assembly or the Legislative Council, as the case may be depending upon the state, when the bill is presented finally to the governor, utilizing the power of Article 200, the governor of the state has 4 options. Here you see only 3 options written, that she may assent the bill, she may withhold the assent to the bill, or she may reserve the bill for the consideration of the president. And there is 4th option, which says that the governor may, as soon as possible, return the bill with a message for reconsideration by the state legislature. But if the bill is again passed by the legislature with or without the amendment, the governor shall not withhold the assent therefrom. Now, right there you see it. But the topic of today's discussion is the reservation of the bill by the governor for the consideration of the president, because it directly impinges upon the federal character of our country. Because governor is directly appointed by the central government. he is considered to be, within quotes, agent of the center. And in the situation where the state government is commanded by the party belonging to the opposition in the center, this often becomes a tool in the hands of the center to control the legislative actions of the state. And so the obvious question which should arise in your mind is that the constitution has specified any conditions under which governor can or may reserve the bill, or the governor has absolute authority, absolute discretionary power while deciding to reserve the bill for the president's consideration. And let me tell you, this is very, very important, because once a bill is reserved by the governor for president's consideration, the enactment of the bill then depends on the assent or refusal of assent by the president. In case of a reserved bill, the president shall, under Article 201, either declare his assent or withhold his assent. Or the president may direct the governor to return the bill together with a message to the state legislature for reconsideration. The state legislature shall then reconsider the bill within 6 months. And if it is again passed, it shall be presented again to the president for his consideration. In contrast with the power of the governor regarding a reconsidered bill, it is not obligatory for the president to give his assent to a reconsidered bill. Now, this is a very, very important point on which you should pay close attention. Because if a bill is sent directly from the governor to the Legislative Assembly for reconsideration, and if it is passed again, it is obligatory on the governor to give assent to the bill. But if it is reserved for the consideration of the president and returned back, it is not obligatory on the president to give assent to the bill. And now you can understand how important this power is. Because if central government does not want a bill to be passed by a state legislature, they can simply ask the governor to reserve the bill for president's consideration. President may decide to sit over it for the longest time because the timeline for the consideration has not been specified in the constitution under Article 200 or 201. And even if the bill is returned to the state assembly and repassed again, it's not mandatory on the president to give assent. And so it is important for us to know what is the criteria which has been chosen for the reservation of the bill. And so that brings us to the criteria for the reservation of the bill by the governor. Now, if we read the Article 200 generally, there is no category of bills which cannot be reserved by the governor to the president. And so if I have to tell you very plainly, the governor can reserve any bill for the consideration of the president. But there are certain bills which must be reserved. So for example, the kinds of bill which derogate or seems to be derogating from the powers of High Court so as to endanger the position which has been constituted by the Constitution of India. So if there is any bill in the state legislature which tries to tweak with the powers of the High Court, it is mandatory. It is a must for the governor to reserve that bill for the consideration of the president. Then there are certain kinds of bill which relate to the imposition of taxes, for example on water, on electricity, and attract the provisions of clause 2 of Article 288. It is mandatory on behalf of the governor to reserve that bill. Then there are certain categories of bill which the constitution says that the governor may reserve. For example, all kinds of bill which relate to a subject enumerated in the concurrent list, and this is done basically to ensure that the state laws are not repugnant or in opposition to the law which has already been passed by the parliament, or other kinds of bill which impose restrictions on trade and commerce may be reserved by the governor. So these are the only sets of instructions, but the language of Article 200 and 201 is such that it enables the governor to reserve almost any bill. And this is what we are observing in Tamil Nadu, because the Tamil Nadu state government and the legislature fear that this bill, being in opposition to a step taken by the central government, could be reserved by the governor for the consideration of the president to forestall a step taken by the Tamil Nadu government, which they claim is very important for the future of their own students. So you can clearly understand how important this topic could be from the perspective of federal structure of the country. And so this provision has been debated not since 2, 3, 4 decades, but also it was a much debated topic even in the Constituent Assembly as well. And so these proponents and opponents are the people who have expressed their views in front of the Commission for Center-State Relation in Punchi Commission. Proponents basically belong to All India Services leaders of the parties which command power in the central government. And so all these people want these provisions of Article 200 and 201 to stay. Because ultimately, if they command the power in the center, they would want to control the state legislations by hook or by crook. And so they argue that the object of these provisions is to ensure broad uniformity of legislation across the country. They feel that if a matter deals directly or indirectly with the items related to concurrent list on which the legislation has already been enacted by a central government, they would want to have some kind of uniformity across the country and would not want a particular state to diverge too much, which is quite a fair argument if you look at it. If you are creating a uniform system of admission to medical colleges, you would not want it to vary from state to state. Then they say that a lot of times state governments come up with very hasty legislations. They do not contemplate upon it, they do not debate over it in their legislatures, and so not just against the concurrent laws, not just against the laws of the parliament, but also this kind of mechanism is very, very important to act as a safety valve against hasty legislations. All those legislations which were not well debated, are not good in law and spirit, can be reserved by the governor for the consideration of the president to enable much more higher level of scrutiny. But this is quite a condescending and stooping view on the level of debate in the state legislatures, given that the amount of time being spent on debate in parliament itself is declining very rapidly. Then the centralists, all those people who want higher power with the central government or parliament, say that this kind of provision is very, very important to ensure conformity with the constitution. Because they believe that India is a union after all. And a state enactment or a legislation might lead to violation of the constitution which they might not be aware of or which they might deliberately want to do. And so in order to check all these tendencies, it is important for them to sometimes reserve bill and all those bills which are even outside the mandatory category of reservation. And then finally, as we have already discussed, that it is important to keep this provision to ensure that there is no repugnancy or the violation of the union laws. So these are the arguments which have been given by the proponents of Article 200 and 201. But at the same time, we know that there are a lot of opponents to these provisions of the Constitution of India as well. And these are mainly by the parties which command power at the regional level or a state level. And the first problem which they say is not the Article 200 itself, which ensures the reservation of the bill or any kind of bill by the governor. But they say that the problematic part is the lack of timeline under which the president has to communicate his or her decision. So the constitution under Article 200 and 201 does not lays down any timeline under which the president has to communicate his or her decision. What this does is that it leads to indefinite delay in the passage of the bill. And so all these states have expressed their concern that the bills so submitted sometimes are indefinitely retained at the central level even beyond the life of the legislature itself. And so such activities on behalf of the central government allows for the democratic will of the state legislature to be thwarted by the executive. And so in a sense, it is a violation of the basic feature of the Constitution of the India. Then of course, unlimited discretionary power of the governor obviously is a very, very problematic matter with the state governments, because they believe that the governor should reserve only those bills which fall under the must category. So according to the state governments, only those legislations which tweak with the powers of the High Court or lead to the imposition of certain taxes or restrict interstate trade and commerce be reserved and not other matters. They argue that this discretionary power is not utilized to save the constitution or repugnancy of a central law, but rather it is misutilized for the political ends. They say that whenever there is a policy of a state government which directly stands in a way of a union policy or a scheme or contradicts it, then governor is asked to utilize the discretionary power by the central government. And then finally, they argue that Article 143 is a very powerful tool available for the president, under which the president can seek opinion of the Supreme Court on matters related to legal and constitutional issues. And so as and when these bills are reserved for the consideration of the president never utilizes this power but takes the decision according to the will of the Central Council of Ministers. But again, this is a violation of the basic feature of the constitution, because the Central Council of Ministers is an executive body. An executive body is subverting a step taken by the legislature of a state, and so this is also a violation of just not federalism but also separation of power. And so in this behalf, there are two important recommendations which have been made by Punchi Commission and Administrative Reforms Commission. So all those state governments which are against the idea of unchecked power of the governor to reserve the bill for the consideration of the president, they say that it may be not such a bad idea to retain Article 200 and 201, but at the same time, you should fix a timeline by amending the Constitution of India. You should specify the time of 6 months under which the president must communicate his or her decision to the governor, and intent the governor should communicate the same to the legislatures. And if you remember, this 6 months period is the same amount of period which has been specified in Article 201 for the state legislatures to act on a reconsidered bill. And so the Punchi Commission believes that the same 6 months time period be applicable on the president also to communicate his or her decision. At the same time, Administrative Reform Commission has suggested that governors should abide by the advice of Council of Ministers on all those matters which are not a must for the reservation. So Administrative Reform Commission believes that governor should act on his or her discretionary power only on those bills which are a must for reservation, for example, High Court, interstate trade, and not on other matters. Whereas on other matters, the governor should abide by the advice of Council of Ministers, which is the basics of the parliamentary system of the government at the state and the central level. Then the next article for today's discussion appeared on the last Sunday, that is on 2nd January in the Hindu newspaper. European Union may label nuclear gas energy as green. So the European Union is planning to label energy from nuclear power and natural gas as green sources for investment, despite internal disagreement over whether they truly qualify as sustainable options. And if you look into GS Paper 3 syllabus, under the infrastructure section, energy appears prominently over there. And this is not just a matter of debate in European Union, but it is also a matter of great debate in India also. And so in this regard, it is important for us to understand what are the pros and cons of these two forms of energy, mainly nuclear and natural, and what are the special concerns which India has over these two forms of energy. Let us now begin the discussion. So starting with the nuclear energy, which is the use of nuclear reactions to produce electricity. Nuclear power can be obtained from nuclear fission, nuclear decay, and also from nuclear fusion reactions. But here, we are only going to keep ourselves limited to the fission reactions, which is a reaction in which the nuclei of an atom splits into two or more smaller nuclei. And this fission reaction releases a very large amount of energy then that can be harnessed to produce electricity. So what are nuclear reactors, how they produce electricity is very basic stuff, can be found in NCERTs as well. And so here we are going to keep ourselves limited. What are the arguments in favor of the nuclear energy? What are the arguments of the people who oppose the nuclear energy? And what are the special challenges or concerns as far as vast scale adoption of nuclear energy in India is concerned? Or what are the concerns which are specific to India? So starting the discussion with the favorable arguments for nuclear energy. Starting with its very clean nature, since it generates power through fission, which is the process of splitting of radioactive nuclei to produce energy. And so there is absolutely no emission of any kind of pollutant or greenhouse gases in the process of energy production. And so there is an image on your screen which shows the comparison of the amount of harmful greenhouse gases and pollutants released by different sources of power. And so predictably you can see that coal lies in the first column right at the top, with the least amount being onshore wind. Nuclear energy sits right there with the cleanest source of energy. But the importance of nuclear energy does not lie only in its clean nature, but also in its reliability. Once a nuclear fission reactor is kicked in, the production of energy starts, and unless and until some unfortunate event of accident occurs, it keeps on producing power for at least 25 to 30 to 35 years, depending upon the kind of fission reaction which has been chosen for that particular reactor. And this is quite opposed to other forms of energy. If you compare it with other clean sources, for example, solar or wind, they are highly contingent or dependent upon the weather situation. If you compare it with coal, it also depends upon the supply of the coal. And if you are keeping in touch with the current affairs, you must have gone through the news of coal crisis in the month of September and October. And so even the coal energy is not as reliable as nuclear energy. Then comes the matter of being adjustable, which means how frequently and how easily you can fluctuate the power being derived from a particular plant. And in that sense, nuclear energy is very handy. Just by inserting or removing the control rods, the power being generated from a nuclear plant can be changed very easily. Then another very good thing about nuclear energy is that it is very, very land efficient, in the sense that the unit of power produced by a particular power source per unit area is very, very high in case of nuclear energy. So for example, a typical 1000 megawatt nuclear facility in US needs a little more than 1 square mile to operate. For production of similar amount of power, a wind farm requires 360 times more land and solar require at least 75 times more land to produce the same amount of power. And so all these qualities exist in nuclear energy, but there is this one special feature which makes it even more important, which is production of very low amount of or minimal waste. And since nuclear energy is extremely dense, if you compare it, it is 1 million times greater than that of other traditional energy sources. And because of this, the amount of used nuclear fuel is not as big. Because ultimately, the only waste which comes out of a nuclear fission reaction is the used rods, which of course be radioactive, but they are not going to take as much space as, for example, ash from a coal power plant. So these are the advantages and some of the very good advantages of nuclear energy, because of which it became the mainstay of our fight against just not for energy security and against global warming and climate change. But of late, a lot of countries have become very resistant to the idea of nuclear energy. And that is because of its increasing opponents. It's because of the increasing opposition to the idea of nuclear energy, because of some very, very prominent disadvantages which it has to offer. Starting with the cost. Because the initial cost of setting up of a nuclear power plant is one of the highest across the world compared to all other sources of energy. And the cost is not only high because the radioactive material themselves are very costly, but because it takes a lot of time for a nuclear power reactor to be built. And there are very few suppliers across the world which command monopoly over this technology. And so overall, this becomes a very, very expensive idea to be constructed and to get it started. But the matter of cost would still be manageable if there were no concerns about safety. But post Fukushima Daiichi mishap in Japan, the countries have become increasingly cautious and wary about this technology, because an accident in a nuclear reactor facility could trigger a series of events which could become unmanageable and would cause devastation, would lead to a lot of loss of life and property. Then, as we have discussed, that nuclear energy stands out because it produces very low amount of waste. But the waste which it produces is not easy to handle, because it is a radioactive waste. And so even after the radioactive material is depleted, it still retains its radioactivity. And so it is not easy for the countries and the government to dispose of that radioactive waste. And so very special mechanisms and arrangements have to be made in order to dispose of the waste coming out of a nuclear power plant. Then, as more and more countries are adopting nuclear energy, there is always a threat of the same material being used to make the nuclear weapon. Because ultimately you have to enrich the natural uranium above 20% to get nuclear energy and increase that enrichment level to 90% and you have a nuclear weapon. And so in the garb of production of nuclear energy, a lot of countries, for example Iran, might be running a nuclear weapons program which would become difficult to distinguish. Although The production of energy from a nuclear power plant is clean, but the mining, milling, and enrichment of uranium into nuclear fuel is very extremely energy intensive and dense. And so it results in a lot of emission of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because a lot of power is utilized in the process of mining and enrichment, which then is ultimately derived from coal power plant. And so if you look the whole life cycle, it boils down to almost the same level. These are the reasons because of which the countries have become extremely wary of adopting nuclear energy at a large scale. But India is not one of the opponents. India has its own share of concerns because of which India's nuclear energy is standing still. And number one reason is the lack of India to get membership into nuclear supplier groups. And this is mainly because of the opposition by China. And you know that how important it is for India to get the membership of NSG because it will essentially increase India's access to state-of-the-art technology from other members of the group because it is a supplier control group. Then due to increasing awareness about the demerits of nuclear energy, India has not been able to smoothly acquire land for the purpose of construction of nuclear power plants. As we have seen in the case of Kudankulam, a lot of people died while protesting against the establishment of a nuclear power plant. Then, India's three-stage nuclear program is still under the very nascent stage of the second stage. India has been able to construct Bhavani reactor, but that is still in the testing stage. Since India is very rich in thorium, India's long-term benefit lies in India's ability to get the three-stage nuclear program kick-started. And then finally, Indian Parliament enacted Nuclear Liability Law, which fixed the liability for a nuclear damage and specified procedures for compensating the victims, because of which most of the original equipment manufacturers of nuclear power plants and reactor fled away from the country. They refused to provide technology and the reactor to India, fearing that if there is an accident which is going to take place, they are going to be held accountable and they will have to pay the compensation specified in the act. And so these are the four specific reasons because of which the nuclear energy is lying standstill in our country. Moving on to the natural gas, which is naturally occurring hydrocarbon gas, which is a mixture consisting mainly of methane and commonly including varying amounts of other higher alkanes and sometimes also a small percentage of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide and helium. And natural gas has been in the news a lot lately, being hailed as the solution to our energy problems on the one hand and potentially environmental nightmare on the other. And just like nuclear energy, let us now try to unearth the pros and cons and India's special concerns, starting with what proponents have to say. Now, proponents say that this is already very widely used source of energy, which already contributes around 21% of the world's energy production today. And so, it would not be a bad idea to adopt it in a wholesome manner. Then, they obviously say that of course it is not as clean as solar or nuclear, but it is cleanest of all fossil fuels because natural gas produces less pollution and greenhouse gases than its counterparts. For example, when you compare it with coal, it produces 45% less carbon dioxide and 30% less carbon dioxide than oil. So you can see that it is already very less polluting as compared to the two common sources of energy currently, coal and crude oil. And then on top of that, it has much higher efficiency than other sources of power because the appliances, the vehicles and the power plants are very highly efficient when they are powered by natural gas. And this high efficiency also one of the factor which contributes in making the natural gas the cleanest one, because if it is very efficient, you have to use very less amount of it. But then there are very strong points against the natural gas as well, which say that after all, natural gas is a non-renewable source of energy and it is mainly methane, which then again is a major greenhouse gas. And the burning of methane ultimately leads to the release of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So in both the ways, you are ultimately releasing a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Then, most of the natural gas currently comes from the fracturing of the wells, which require large amount of water, which may ultimately affect aquatic habitats and the availability of the water for other uses. Also, The natural gas exploration, drilling, and production affects the environment because a large amount of area is rendered useless, either for humans or for the natural wildlife. And so these are the reasons because of which the opponents make a very strong case against the usage of natural gas. But then, just like nuclear energy, there are India specific cases as well. Starting with, just like all other fossil fuels except for coal, we have very limited quantities of natural gas reserves in our country, which means that India is going to be perpetually dependent on import for its energy security. And even so, if we decide to increase the sources of power based on natural gas, high level of import dependence on energy is not good, but it would still be manageable if there was no price fluctuation. But as the last year has shown, with the shooting prices of natural gas in the international market, it would not be a good idea for India to adopt natural gas on a large scale basis. A very important news article appears on page number 10. Maldives inks key deals with China. So Beijing has agreed on visa exemption for Maldivians and has signed aid pact on infrastructure. So Maldives and China on Saturday signed key bilateral agreements during Chinese foreign minister's visit on developing and maintaining infrastructure in Indian Ocean archipelago, besides agreeing on a visa-free travel arrangement for Maldivians intending to travel to China. And this is an important turn of event. And so in this regard, we are going to multidimensionally cover India-Maldives relation because it is a part of your syllabus. Now, first we will focus on the map and see the location of the Maldives with its capital at Malé. A lot of coral islands. It is an archipelago which is very close to the Indian waters. Now, being close to Indian waters is not sufficient enough reason for Maldives to become important for India. It is important because it is strategically located in Indian Ocean. The 1200 or so islands of Maldives lie next to key shipping lanes which ensure uninterrupted energy supplies to countries like China, Japan and India as well. So having good relations with Maldives is of critical importance for India in order to secure not only its energy security, but also in future to be able to control the energy supplies to China. Now we all know India's preeminent position in South Asia and its image as net security provider in Indian Ocean region. And so it is very important for India to cooperate with Maldives in security and defense sector to live up to that image of net security provider. You might know that Maldives is also a member of SAARC. It is important for India to have Maldives on board to maintain its leadership in the region. Now, relations with Maldives, when they were not good in 2015 and 16, and hence it was the only country in the SAARC which was reluctant to follow India's call for boycott of SAARC summit in Pakistan after the Uri attack. And so you can easily see how important it is for India to keep Maldives on board always. Apart from that, India, especially the Kerala and Lakshadweep islands, share close ethnic, linguistic and cultural ties with the people. The largest ethnic group is Dhivehin, the people who are native to the region of Maldive Islands comprising today's Republic of Maldives as well as island of Minicoy and Union Territory of Lakshadweep. They share same culture and speak the same language as well. And so that is why Maldives is very, very important for India. And so in the past, India has always lived up to the expectation and has come to help Maldives. For example, in 1998, when armed mercenaries attempted a coup against President Abdul Gayoom, India sent paratroopers and navy vessels and restored the legitimate leadership under Operation Cactus. In 2004, that was the year when the tsunami struck the Indian Ocean region, India had provided assistance to Maldives and had also supported it during the drinking crisis in 2014. During COVID-19 pandemic, India rushed $250 million aid in quick time. India has also rushed medical supplies from time to time, including food and water supplies. India also maintains a naval presence in Maldives on the behest of Maldives, that is on the request of the Maldives. In return, Maldives has always supported India's claim in major international forums and organizations, and the recently elected government has affirmed Maldives' India First policy. which was reciprocated by announcing an assistance package of around $1.4 billion by the Indian government. And so, what could go wrong as far as India Maldives relations are concerned? There are three main challenges or issues in our relationship. The first is, since last 2 decades, there is a continuous and gradual enhancement of Chinese presence on Maldivian soil. For example, Maldives signed first country-specific free trade agreement with China in 2017, thereby becoming China's second FTA in South Asia after Pakistan. If you consider the overall foreign debt of Maldives, 70% of the foreign debt is owed to China. So you can say that Maldives is in a kind of debt trap with Chinese. Then there has been a growing trend of Chinese companies and individuals acquiring land in Maldives. The land grab is seen in excess of what East India Company had acquired during the colonial period in Maldives. And so this land grab has raised concern of Maldives being increasingly falling into an economic neo-colonial influence of China. Although the new government of President Solih has affirmed that Maldives will scrap the FTA with China and investigate all the Chinese land grabs in Maldives, but due to the debt trap in which the Maldives has already fallen, it seems impossible to do that right now. Then the term of last President Mr. Yamin was the worst phase of India-Maldives relations. He was not only a dictator, anti-democratic person who declared emergency in Maldives and halted the functioning of Maldives parliament and also arrested several opposition leaders, but was also extremely anti-India and pro-China. He solidified relations with China without taking India into confidence. Under President Yamin's regime, Male had terminated the agreement it entered into with GMR, that is an Indian company for modernization of international airport. And various other actions which were taken by President Yamin are very difficult to reverse, and hence the hangover of the term of President Yamin is going to create concerns as far as India-Maldives relations are concerned. And the third important factor which is a cause of concern for India is the growing radicalization in Maldivian society. Now you would be surprised to know that the Maldives had become the country with the highest rate of foreign fighters per capita in the world. For its population, it sent the maximum number of terrorists to fight for Islamic State. And so, after the debacle or after the decimation of Islamic State, all these foreign fighters are now returning back into the country, and that has led to an apprehension by India that will lead to an increase in the influence of Islamic State, and hence it will help in boosting radicalization in that sense. The relations between India and Maldives are now in an upswing because the current government and the president are quite favorable to India. But just like the past, the things can change very drastically. And so India needs to build on the positive public image that it has to further cement the ties between India and Maldives. India tops Sri Lanka's tourism list, appears on page number 8. So India topped Sri Lanka's tourist arrivals in December and the entire year, according to data published by the Sri Lanka Tourism Development Authority. So the report says that Sri Lanka recorded 89,000 tourist arrivals, of whom 23,566 or around 26% people were from India, signaling that India had regained its spot as the largest source market in its tourism sector. Sri Lanka being India's one of the closest maritime neighbors, it is important for us to cover it from the perspective of GS Paper 2 syllabus at the main stage. Because the line of the syllabus, just like the last article, says India and its neighborhood relations. And whenever we try to analyze India and its neighborhood relations, we just don't have to keep ourselves limited to the challenges between the two neighbors. We also have to talk about areas of cooperation, or in the language of international relation, we called convergences. So convergences, challenges which mean divergences, and what could be a way forward through which the countries can resolve their challenges and increase their areas of cooperation. So let us now begin the discussion by first understanding the areas of cooperation between India and Sri Lanka. So as far as the areas of cooperation are concerned, there are 4 clear areas, which are trade, culture, development projects, and strategic partnerships. Now to start with the trade. Sri Lanka is one of the India's largest trading partner in SAARC. India in turn is Sri Lanka's largest trade partner globally. Now, apart from good trading relations, India already has a free trade agreement with Sri Lanka which was signed in 2000. And right now, the two countries are negotiating economic and technological cooperation agreement, which would be FTA plus. Now, as far as the next dimension of cooperation is concerned, culture is something which is very important in case of India and Sri Lanka. Buddhism, spread by Ashoka in Sri Lanka, is one of the strong pillars connecting both the nations, which originated in India and then spread to Sri Lanka. The other important binding link between India and Sri Lanka as far as religion goes is Hinduism. Not only a significant minority group of Tamilians are Hindus, but also the prominent mention of Sri Lanka island in the epic of Ramayana ensures that a lot of Hindus go for pilgrim to the important religious sites mentioned in the epic of Ramayana. Then if we talk about the development aspect of areas of cooperation, Sri Lanka plays a very crucial role in India's development as it provides the facility of transshipment from the ports like Colombo and Hambantota, which handle huge cargo that comes to India. And the reason is that India has not been able to fully develop a transshipment port along the southern coast. Then apart from that, India has been carrying out a lot of development projects in Sri Lanka. For example, India's housing projects and railway construction in the Jaffna or the northeastern part of Sri Lanka to help the war-torn region. Then the next important area of cooperation is strategic cooperation. And if you know, you would appreciate that India and Sri Lanka hold common membership of three important groups: SAARC, BIMSTEC, and Indian Ocean Rim Association. And apart from that, Sri Lanka is also important for India in its ambitions to become net security provider in Indian Ocean. And so pursuing strong ties with Sri Lanka is an integral part of India's neighborhood first policy. But analyzing the events of past 10 to 20 years, India and Sri Lanka relationship face very significant challenges, which can be categorized into four different groups. One is, of course, the Chinese factor, which is always there whenever we talk about India and its neighborhood relations. Then there is a peculiar case of ethnic issue in Sri Lanka. Then the issues of fishermen and stalled infra projects or inability of the India to complete infrastructural projects or to compete with China as far as construction of novel projects in Sri Lanka is concerned. So let us now have a look at each one of them one by one. So whenever we talk about the challenges and we talk about Chinese influence in Sri Lanka's internal and external matters, there are four important events which we recall. For example, scrapping of Indian infrastructure projects like Colombo East Container Port Terminal at a time when China is increasing its investment in same Colombo port city. Then recently, Sri Lanka gave approval to Chinese funded Colombo port city with some autonomy. Apart from that, we already know that China had developed Hambantota port, which was later leased to it for a period of 99 years because the Sri Lanka was unable to repay the loans on the debts it had from China. And then Sri Lanka has also endorsed Belt and Road Initiative of China. So these are the factors which clearly indicate a decisive turn which Sri Lanka has taken as far as India and China is concerned. Then apart from the Chinese factor, the next important challenges which India and Sri Lanka face is that of ethnic issue. The long drawn ethnic conflicts and human rights violation of Tamils have always been a troublesome issue between the two. But even after that, the lack of proper rehabilitation and lack of implementation of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka to the northern Tamil provinces have further strained the ties. Because this was the commitment of Sri Lanka to not just its own people but also to the Indian government. Then the next set of challenges come from fishermen, because of which we are discussing India-Sri Lanka relations. Sri Lankan fishermen object to Indians using bottom trawlers and fishing illegally along their coast, which often leads to arrests of Indians. Apart from that, the disputed status of the island of Kachativu is still not resolved and continues to be a problematic issue between India and Sri Lanka. Then the last major sticking point between India and Sri Lanka is the inability of India to get its infrastructural projects concluded and completed within time, be it Jaffna's hybrid energy project or be it Sampur power plant, both of which have not been completed, and in fact Sampur power project has been cancelled. This also includes a long list of infrastructural projects, for example, East Container Terminal project, which was cancelled within last 3 months. And so this brings us to the issue how to go about India and Sri Lanka relations moving forward. What is the way forward so that we can resolve these issues? So moving forward, since India and Sri Lanka have close cultural ties, both countries should focus on deepening people-to-people contact. Apart from that, India should also insist on Sri Lanka to prioritize India's interest in defense as well as in geostrategic arena, which are non-compromisable. Then India should leverage the strength of its economic relation with Sri Lanka, because we have seen that India is the largest trading partner of Sri Lanka in the South Asian region. And then resolving fishermen issue should be kept on priority, because this is what creates a domestic pressure on both the countries. So this is it as far as India and Sri Lanka relations are concerned. You should prepare all the bilateral relations with the neighbors along the same directions by trying to highlight the areas of cooperation, then trying to identify the challenging issues, and then finally looking for way forward. Let us now move on to the next discussion. LCA Mk1A to take flight in June appears on page number 8 in the Hindu newspaper today, which is a larger aircraft which will be rolled out by the year end or early 2023, says HAL MD. And so in this regard, it becomes very important for us to understand some of the basics about HAL. It is an Indian multi-role light fighter designed by ADA, or Aeronautical Development Agency, in collaboration with Aircraft Research and Design Center of HAL for the Indian Air Force and Indian Navy. In 2003, the LCA was officially named as Tejas. It is the smallest and the lightest in its class of contemporary supersonic combat aircrafts, and its primary user, of course, would be Indian Air Force. So as far as the variants go, the Tejas currently has 3 production models: Tejas Mark 1, Mark 1A, and a trainer variant. The IAF currently placed an order of around 40 Tejas Mark 1 and 83 Tejas Mark 1A, including Tejas trainer aircraft. Apart from this, the Indian Air Force plans to procure 324 aircraft in all variants, including the Tejas Mark II currently being developed by HAL. If we talk about Tejas Mark II, or medium weight fighter, which will be an enhanced version of Tejas Mark 1 design, which is expected to have more powerful engine and an increased payload carrying capacity. The Tejas Mark II will feature an ISR radar, an on-board oxygen generation system, and built-in electronic warfare suite, among other improvements to avionics. So after having discussed these news articles, let us now move on and see what are the articles which we have already taken up in DNS. Now, 2 sets of very similar articles appeared in Indian Express and the Hindu last week. What will be the impact of China's border law appeared on the Hindu newspaper on 2nd of January, and China's border law in India appeared in explained section on 3rd of January. So China has recently passed a border law. It aims at securing the Chinese borders with its neighbors. However, concerns have been raised about the intent of the Chinese government in the wake of its recent expansionist tendencies. And so we already know that China has around 22,457 kilometer land border with 14 nations, which also includes India, which is the 3rd longest after Mongolia and Russia. And so under the law, China is required by law to install boundary markers on all its land borders in order to clearly designate the border. The law also states that the state must take steps to strengthen border defense, support economic and social development upon the border areas. Along with that, the Chinese state is going to take public service and infrastructure improvement along the border areas. Now, in this regard, what are the issues of India with China as far as border relation goes has already been discussed multiple times in our daily news simplified videos. And so we are not going to take up this news today. Then this next article, the rule of guns that continues to haunt India, appeared on the Hindu newspaper last Sunday, which talks about a much debated topic of last month, which is UPSC. It is needless to say that it has already been discussed in our DNS multiple times. Then the next article of importance was economically weaker sections as defined by the government panel, appeared in the Indian Express in last week. And just like other topics mentioned in the sequence, this has already been taken in the DNS, and so you can go through the analysis as shown on the screen. Let us now move on to the question of the day.